Something is shifting in the unseen layers of reality. If you've been feeling that strange charge in the atmosphere lately, that subtle pressure in your chest, or those sudden waves of old memories appearing out of nowhere at the most random hours, you are not imagining it. There has been a long period of stillness between you and this person, almost like everything was frozen in place, caught in a painful pause that neither side knew how to break. But beneath that quiet surface, something has never been still. It has been building, like deep underground forces, slowly pressing against each other, creating tension that cannot stay contained forever. What has felt stuck is reaching its limit, and when movement finally begins, it will not be gentle or subtle. It will feel like something breaking open that has been held shut for far too long. You have been living in a strange, emotional in-between space, not fully letting go, not fully holding on, suspended between hope and acceptance, between longing and surrender. And that kind of emotional suspension can feel like being caught in time itself, watching life move forward while something inside you stays behind, unresolved. But nothing in life stays stagnant forever. Even what looks like stillness is actually preparation, a pause before motion, a long inhale before the exhale that changes everything. What feels like delay is often just the gathering of force before a turning point arrives. Carl Jung once described how the meeting of two people is like the contact of two chemical elements. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. And that reaction between you and this person was never truly absent. It was only delayed, slowed down by fear, by pride, by emotional defenses, and by all the subtle ways people avoid the very feelings that would change them the most. But what is real cannot remain frozen forever. Right now, something is forming in the invisible structure of this connection, something that is preparing to become visible in the physical world. And when it does, it will feel sudden, even shocking, as if something long buried has finally pushed its way to the surface. If you quiet your mind enough, you may already sense it, that low pressure, that inner knowing that something is approaching, a shift that will require emotional courage, not comfort, something that will challenge both sides in ways they have never been challenged before. And on their side, the inner world is not as calm as it appears on the outside. There is a storm forming in their thoughts, a private unraveling that no one else can see. The mental structure they built to stay in control, to stay detached, to stay protected, is beginning to weaken. Piece by piece, the denial is collapsing, revealing feelings they tried very hard not to admit even to themselves. They once believed that distance would solve it, that silence would reduce the intensity, that time would slowly weaken the pull between you until it became something forgettable. But the opposite has happened. The more they tried to step away, the stronger the presence of you became inside them. Every day of separation has deepened the awareness instead of erasing it. Every moment of silence has made your absence louder, not quieter. Because some connections don't dissolve under distance, they intensify under it. For a long time, pride has acted like a shield, a carefully built structure meant to protect them from vulnerability, from rejection, from the possibility of being fully seen. But that shield is no longer holding the weight of what they feel. What they are beginning to realize is uncomfortable. What they feel for you has already disrupted their inner balance far more than they admitted. You appear in their daily life in ways they cannot control. A sound, a scent, a passing moment of light, a familiar song in an unfamiliar place. Each one becomes a trigger, pulling you back into their awareness again and again. It is not occasional anymore. It is constant. They tried to replace what they feel, tried to convince themselves that this depth of connection could be replicated, substituted, or simply ignored. But every attempt only confirmed what they did not want to accept. What they feel is not easily replaceable. And the space you occupy in them is not something that can be casually filled. At this point, something inside them has crossed a threshold. This is no longer about small gestures or hidden curiosity. Not the silent watching from a distance. Not the indirect signs. Not the controlled breadcrumbs of attention meant to test if you are still emotionally available. What is forming now is something far more direct, something that cannot hide behind ambiguity or half measures. It is an action that will require honesty at a level they have avoided until now. They are preparing to step into emotional exposure, to remove the layers of control and defense they have relied on, to say or do something that leaves no room for misunderstanding, no space for guessing games, no uncertainty about intention. And that level of openness is exactly what terrifies them the most. Because once it is done, there is no returning to the old distance in the same way again. They understand the risk clearly. There is a possibility that what they do will not be received the way they hope. There is a possibility that too much time has already passed, that the emotional door they once hesitated at may no longer open. But they are also realizing something deeper than fear, living with uncertainty, living with unanswered questions, and carrying the weight of "what if I had tried" is heavier than the risk of rejection itself. So they are gathering courage, not in a dramatic moment, but slowly, privately, in the quiet spaces of their own mind, rehearsing words they may finally speak, facing truths they avoided for a long time, preparing for a decision that feels irreversible. This is not impulsive. It has been building through realization after realization, especially after a moment that disrupted their denial, when they saw or sensed that your life is continuing forward with or without them. And that realization created something they could no longer ignore, because it made everything real in a way avoidance could not fix anymore. And now they stand at the edge of that inner threshold, between silence and expression, between fear and truth, between staying hidden and finally stepping into honesty. And whatever happens next will not just change the connection, it will change them. Because as long as they could still convince themselves that you were stuck in the same emotional waiting space they were living in, they had room to delay, room to stay in control, room to believe they could decide the timing of if and when this connection would ever return. But that illusion is starting to collapse. Seeing you happy, even in something as simple as a photo, noticing you smiling, moving forward, existing in a calm they are no longer part of, that did something deeper than they expected. It didn't just make them miss you, it triggered something instinctive, something primal, a sudden internal alarm that bypassed logic and went straight into survival-level fear. Because now, this is no longer an abstract, maybe I lose you someday thought. It feels real, immediate, possible in a way they can no longer ignore. And when a person finally feels that kind of emotional loss as real, everything inside them shifts. In that moment, control stops feeling like safety. Pride stops feeling like protection. Distance stops feeling like power. And what rises underneath it all is something much more vulnerable, the fear of irreversible loss. And that fear changes the entire internal equation. Or maybe it didn't come from the outside at all. Maybe there was no single trigger, no specific image, no particular moment. Maybe it came from inside them, slowly building until something finally cracked. A quiet breaking point where carrying unspoken emotion became heavier than their ability to suppress it. A moment where pretending not to care stopped working, where the effort of holding themselves together in silence became more painful than the risk of speaking, where they looked inward and couldn't recognize the version of themselves they had become, someone exhausted by emotional restraint, drained by avoidance, and distant even from their own truth. Either way, something has fractured in them. A pressure valve has opened. What they've been holding back is no longer fully contained. And once that internal barrier weakens, emotion doesn't trickle out, it moves. It pushes forward with momentum, demanding expression, demanding resolution. But before anything reaches you, they've had to face something even harder, themselves. Because real connection doesn't survive in emotional avoidance. And they can't step toward you while still fragmented inside, still divided between fear and desire, still unconsciously repeating patterns they never fully understood. Carl Jung pointed out that when the unconscious remains unexamined, it quietly runs the show while the conscious mind calls it fate. And this is exactly what they've been living through, watching themselves repeat emotional patterns they didn't fully understand, yet couldn't seem to stop. The push and pull, the closeness followed by withdrawal, the longing followed by distance, the same cycle repeating under different circumstances, with different people, but always leading back to the same emotional outcome. And slowly, painfully, awareness started to form. They began to see the pattern instead of just living inside it. The parts of themselves that learned early that closeness isn't safe. The emotional imprint that associated love with eventual loss. The internal belief that leaving first somehow prevents being left. These weren't conscious decisions. They were survival strategies formed long before this connection ever existed. But now they are being forced into awareness, not as blame, but as understanding. And in that understanding, something new starts to appear, the possibility of change. Not destruction of who they are, but integration. The ability to see their fear without being ruled by it, to recognize their defenses without being controlled by them, to hold both their longing and their fear in the same awareness without collapsing into avoidance. This is the inner work they've been moving through in private moments, reflection, emotional processing, long stretches of silence where everything they avoided begins to surface, and something inside them is no longer resisting it the same way. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can't fully unsee it, and that changes everything that follows. What comes next is no longer just emotional reaction, it becomes choice. A letter they may write and rewrite a dozen times before sending. A message they can't send impulsively because it carries too much weight. A phone call they rehearse in their mind but still don't feel ready for. Or a face-to-face moment they know will strip away every remaining layer of distance between you. Whatever form it takes, the essence will be the same. Exposure. No more ambiguity. No more controlled distance. No more half-presence or indirect signals meant to test whether the connection still exists. Only truth, offered without protection. And that is what terrifies them most, not rejection itself, but the complete absence of control over how that truth will be received. Because once they step into honesty at this level, there is no returning to the version of themselves that could hide behind silence. They will have to admit what they feel, what they avoided, what they lost in the process of trying not to lose control. They may say they were scared, that they didn't know how to stay present without feeling overwhelmed. That distance became their way of coping with emotions they couldn't fully regulate, that what looked like detachment was actually internal conflict they never knew how to express properly. Not as excuses, but as recognition. Because at this stage, the goal is no longer to protect their image. It is to finally tell the truth without filtering it through pride. And that truth, however it arrives, will carry weight. It will be imperfect, human, possibly shaky, possibly emotional, possibly uncertain in delivery, but unmistakably real in intention. And in offering it, they are crossing a line they can't uncross. They are stepping out of the safety of emotional distance and into direct vulnerability, where they are no longer protected by silence, interpretation, or delay. Only presence, only consequence, and they know the risk. You may have already moved beyond the space where their words can reach you. You may not respond the way they hope. You may not feel what they still feel. The door they hesitated at may no longer open in the same way. But what they are beginning to understand is that carrying silence forward is heavier than facing truth. So they are preparing, not dramatically, but internally, quietly gathering the courage to act despite uncertainty. Reaching a point where not trying feels more painful than risking failure. And whatever happens after that moment will not just define the connection, it will redefine them. They understand, more deeply than they ever allowed themselves to before, that this time they are risking everything. There is no comfortable version of this outcome for them anymore, no fantasy where they speak, you instantly soften, and everything resets as if nothing happened. That illusion is gone. What remains is far more uncertain and far more real. They might hear you say it is too late, that the wound they created has already healed in a different direction, that your life has expanded into something that no longer has a space shaped like them inside it, that the version of love you once held has already transformed into something quieter, something detached, something that no longer reaches for what hurt it. And that possibility hits harder than anything else, because indifference carries a finality that anger never does. Anger still connects. Indifference closes the door without emotion, without struggle, without resistance. It simply no longer needs them. They may have to face the reality that you chose someone else, or that you chose yourself in a way that no longer includes them, that the future they kept privately imagining has already been rewritten without their participation, and there is no version of courage that can undo what has already been lost. Yet even with that awareness, they are still moving toward truth, because at some point in their inner reckoning, something shifted. Regret for trying began to feel lighter than regret for remaining silent. The pain of being rejected became easier to imagine than the lifelong weight of wondering what would have happened if they had finally been honest. And that realization changes a person from within. It does not guarantee outcome. It does not promise reunion. It only changes direction. But here is where clarity becomes essential, because not every return is transformation, and not every confession is truth. Time, intensity, and emotional language can create the illusion of change even when nothing fundamental has shifted underneath. Real change is not loud. It does not rely on urgency or emotional pressure. It does not appear only when loss becomes visible. It reveals itself in consistency, especially when no reassurance is being received in return. You will recognize it in something much quieter than words. It will be in how they behave when there is nothing immediate to gain, in how they respond when you are slow, unsure, or even distant, in how they handle your boundaries without trying to negotiate them away, in whether they can remain steady in discomfort without turning it into your responsibility. Because transformation is not proven at the moment of confession. It is proven in the time after it. Manipulation, even when unconscious, cannot maintain that level of consistency for long. It depends on urgency, emotional intensity, and the hope of quick resolution. But genuine inner change has a different rhythm. It is slower, less dramatic, more stable. It does not collapse when attention is not immediately returned, and when they finally appear before you, if they do, you will not need to decode their words as much as observe their capacity to stay real over time. No inflated promises. No performance of perfection. No attempt to erase the past with speeches that sound complete but feel disconnected from lived behavior. Instead, you will notice something more grounded. Accountability without defense. Presence without pressure. Patience without hidden expectation. And even then, you are not required to respond in any predetermined way. You are not obligated to reopen what has already closed itself within you. You are not required to forgive simply because someone has finally found the courage to speak. And you are not bound to reciprocate feelings that may no longer exist in the same form they once did. If something inside you has moved on, you are allowed to acknowledge that honestly. You are allowed to say that healing has taken you somewhere else, that your emotional landscape is no longer shaped by the same connection. You are also allowed to say, not yet. To recognize sincerity without immediately offering access. To see change without immediately restoring trust. To allow time to reveal whether what you are witnessing is stable or temporary. And yes, you are also allowed to say no. To accept that some fractures do not return to their original form, that growth can sometimes separate rather than reconnect. That endings are not always failures, but honest reflections of what no longer aligns. At the same time, you are allowed to say yes, to risk again, to rebuild carefully, to meet vulnerability with vulnerability if your own inner truth genuinely moves in that direction. To believe that some connections, even after rupture, can evolve into something more conscious, more grounded, more real than before. All of these responses are valid. What matters is not which direction you choose, but whether the choice comes from clarity rather than emotional pressure, from awareness rather than reaction, from your own truth rather than the weight of someone else's urgency. Because the most important transformation is not only happening on their side, it is also happening in your capacity to recognize what is real, what is performative, and what is simply no longer aligned with who you have become. And that recognition is what will guide your response when the moment arrives. Because the moment is approaching. Not in some distant, abstract sense, but in the way emotional pressure eventually demands expression in the physical world. What has been building internally does not remain internal forever. It finds form, it finds action. It becomes visible through words, gestures, or contact that can no longer be delayed. You may notice signs before it happens, subtle coincidences, emotional synchronicities, memories surfacing without warning, moments that feel personally charged in ways you cannot easily explain. But what matters most is not prediction, it is preparation. Not preparation for a specific outcome, but preparation for presence, for clarity, for the ability to meet whatever arrives without losing yourself inside it. Because when that moment comes, if it comes, you will not only be responding to them, you will be responding to everything you have learned about love, boundaries, healing, and self-respect. And whatever you choose from that place will not be confusion. It will be clarity in action.